Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our webcast with our founder and president, Helga Zepp LaRouche. Today is November 10th, 2019. Yesterday was the 30th anniversary of a momentous event in modern history, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which occurred 30 years ago. In a speech given yesterday in New York City, Helga Zepp LaRouche gave a full evaluation of the difference between the official narrative, which continues to be presented today, versus the reality, what really happened. And I think, Helga, in order to make sure that people can make the right decisions today, when we face another momentous crisis, it's extremely important for people to hear from you what actually happened and what are the implications of that. So why don't you give us a report on what you said yesterday?
Well, I think that the official narrative, as you say, about what happened in '89 and the reality are absolutely two different stories. Because if you listen to all the speeches, given by the officials in Berlin and media commentators, it's all, that this was the victory of democracy and freedom, and that basically, communism lost. Well, the reality is that from our perspective, this was an unbelievable moment in history, what we call the Star Hour, Sternstunde der Menschheit, an incredible historical chance, which would have given the potential to completely reshape the order of the 21st century in the direction of a peace order. Because after all, you had communism eventually 2 years later disappeared, and you could have put in a concept of, like what we proposed with the Eurasian Landbridge a little bit later. But this was completely missed. And if you look at the situation today, you see actually, 30 years afterwards, the entire world, the entire globe is in disarray, in upheaval. And, the fall of the wall was the starting point, but a little bit later, the American historian Fukuyama basically declared this the end of history, meaning that democracy would, be embraced at every corner of the world, and therefore, no longer historical developments really would occur. Now, obviously, you have the complete opposite. You have mass demonstrations, some of them bigger than the Monday demonstrations in Leipzig or other East German cities, Chile, Haiti. You have mass demonstrations in Pakistan, in Iraq, in Lebanon. You have a complete discontent in much of the European Union. The German farmers, the yellow vests, Brexit. All of these phenomena are not exactly a sign that the present world order is being embraced by everybody, but just the contrary. So actually, we should discuss, what was our option and what actually happened.
Important thing is that we were on the scene. You were very much on the scene, and you and your husband, Lyndon LaRouche, had presented a series of alternatives. Why don't you go through a little bit of that? Because again, this was an opportunity, and you've characterized this as the missed opportunity of 1989. What could have been done differently?
Well, I mean, it should go back until '84, actually, because at that point, when the Soviet government rejected the offer by President Reagan to jointly get rid of nuclear weapons, which was really what the SDI proposal of my husband was all about. When the Soviet government at that point rejected that, he predicted that if the Soviet Union would stick to their then existing policies, they would collapse in 5 years. Now, as far as I know, there was nobody else who had that view. And, even when the wall came down, nobody thought the unification would happen. The entire social democracy is on the record of saying, that this would never happen, that this was the lie of the century. But we looked at it differently. We looked at it from the economic effects of the rejection of the SDI and the effort to maintain military superiority by the Soviet Union. Now, in 1988, it became very clear that the economic difficulties of the Comecon increased significantly. So my husband, Lyndon LaRouche, and I went to Berlin, and we gave a press conference in the Kempinski Hotel, where he basically said that the German unification would soon be on the agenda, with Berlin as the capital, and that the unified Germany should develop Poland with Western technologies. Now, I remember the journalists looking, blank-faced. Nobody believed that this would happen. But, a year later, exactly 1 year later, in October, the Monday demonstrations became bigger. And on the 9th of November, the wall did open. And, at that point, you had an unbelievable moment of history. People will remember, and this picture which you see here in the background is exactly capturing that moment, that people were actually dancing on the Berlin Wall. They, embraced each other. They were crying of joy. There was an absolutely elevated moment in history, which did last for quite a bit. But as the official documents published by the German government a little bit later admitted, that despite the fact that German unification was the policy aim of post-war Germany, the Federal Republic that is, the government did not have a contingency plan of what actually to do, because obviously they really did not assume this would ever happen in their lifetime. Now, we were therefore the absolute only force which had a conception what to do. And, they threw my husband in jail already at the beginning of '89. So I basically took recourse to what he had said in '88. And I wrote the first leaflet with the title, Beloved Germany, Continue with Confidence. Because at that time, people were still quite nervous. It was not clear if there would be ever the use of military force. After all, 56 in Hungary had happened, then also Prague 68. So it was still a period of uncertainty. And I proposed in that leaflet that Germany should unify and develop Poland together as a model for the transformation of the Comecon. Now, the only other policy which came was that of Helmut Kohl, who on the 28th of November presented his so-called 10-point program. These were not yet a proposal for unification, but for a confederate, the two states to be a confederate in a confederation. And that he did not discuss with either the allies nor with Genscher, the foreign minister. And that tiny baby step in the direction of sovereignty, just a baby step, was obviously too much. 2 days later, Herrhausen was assassinated, who was the head of Deutsche Bank at that time. And, he was supposed to give a speech 1 week later in New York, where he, very much in parallel to what we were saying, and we did not coordinate that at all, it was just a parallel thinking, where he would have proposed the development of Poland and other Eastern states with the same method like the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau in the post-war period. That is outside of the IMF and, state credit for real investments in the real economy. So this speech, Herrhausen naturally could never hold because he was assassinated by the very dubious third generation of the Baader-Meinhof group, the RAF, Red Army faction. And, this was discussed behind closed doors. And, people were saying this was a message to coal, to absolutely not step out of line and not offer anything which would not be agreed with the Western allies. Now, obviously, the geopolitical worry was that if Germany would be unified and develop a positive relationship to Russia, then that would completely upset the entire machinations of the NATO to, keep Germany down, to, basically keep Russia out. And, so what happened then was Kohl completely got bombarded at the next EU meeting in Strasbourg. He later called that the darkest hour of his life because everybody was attacking him. And so basically what we did, we published this report of the productive triangle. This was the idea to take the area of Paris, Berlin, Vienna, which has the size of a triangular of the size of Japan, which had the most advanced industries of the world at that time, and to renovate that and innovate through modern technologies, through the Transrapid, through other investments in modern industries, and then use that triangle to bring corridors to Eastern Europe, to connect this triangular with Warsaw, with Kiev, with the Balkans, and transform the industries of the East. Now, the industries of the East were perfectly fine. They were just not competitive on the world market. But for example, the industrial potential of countries like Czechoslovakia was absolutely powerful. And if you would have shipped these industries, on big ships and bring it to Africa, every country in Africa would have been very happy to have them. So what this proposal is to basically, modernize the existing industries with Western technologies, and then use the existing industrial capacities of the East to use them up for the construction of infrastructure, which was the big bottleneck of not only the Soviet Union, but of the Comecon and the GDR in general. Now, this proposal was absolutely in the interest of Germany. It was in the interest of all East European countries, and it would have, allowed an easy transformation and modernization. Now, that potential obviously was not in the liking of Thatcher, who immediately started the Fourth Reich campaign against Kohl and Germany, which was ridiculous because Kohl was for sure not a new Hitler. Mitterrand, who according to the biography of Jacques Attali, was threatening Germany with war if they would not give up the D-Mark for the euro. And Bush Senior, contrary to what Pompeo was trying to say when he now was in Berlin, Bush was initially totally against Germany unification, and only because people like Ben Scowcroft told him that the United States would lose any influence in Europe if they would in this moment be against German unification, then they modified their view and basically said, let's have Germany contained through self-containment by integrating them not only in NATO and the EU, but by imposing the Maastricht Treaty with all of its austerity mechanisms to basically prevent that the unified Germany would break out in any form. So that was the strategic geopolitical setting why our proposal was not accepted, despite the fact that many firms and many CEOs of large firms at the Leipzig Fair and other places where we talked to them said this is exactly what should happen, but this is such a big job that it must be done by governments. This cannot be done by private industry. Now, things went relatively okay. And up to May, people still were absolutely convinced this was the great historical change of '89. But then, the Treuhand, which was founded in March 1990, was first supposed to organize the transformation of the state-owned industries, and it was the largest industrial holding in the world at that time. Now, as long as Rohwedder, Detlef Rohwedder, who came in as the head of the Treuhand in August 1990, and he had a very good policy because he said we have to have first restoration and then look if we can have privatization, because the key question is to protect the jobs. Now, that was an absolutely sound policy, but then he got assassinated in April 91. And in my view, this is when the real big, disaster happened, because he was replaced by Birgit Breuil, a banker's daughter from Hamburg, whose bank in the Second World War had played a very dubious role in financing, together with the Harrimans and Montagu Norman, the NSDAP. And Birgit Breuil had no such restrictions. She went for a complete privatization. And what happened then was an absolute takeover of the locusts, privatize everything for simple profit, no respect for the protection of the jobs. And this is something which I think is still very deep in the conscience and in the memory of the people of the former GDR, because basically all of a sudden their whole life work was worth nothing. And you had basically a takeover from Western firms, and the Eastern firms were completely swallowed. The political system was swallowed. The Western parties came with big pockets and paid people right and left. And I think that this is really, where things started to go wrong. And this continued then obviously throughout the 90s with the shock therapy against Russia. In 91, we, however, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, we prolonged this productive triangle to become the Eurasian Landbridge by simply, saying now the Iron Wall is no longer there, and we can connect the population and industrial centers from Europe with those of Asia through development corridors. And we called this the Eurasian Landbridge, the new Silk Road. Now that, again, would have been a perfect way to have a peace order for the 21st century. And, unfortunately, as people will remember, what was behind Fukuyama's idea of end of history and democracy everywhere was the brutal attempt by the British Empire, by the neocons in the United States, to impose an unipolar world. And then they continued, to push that with regime change, with color revolution, by breaking the promise which was given to Gorbachev to not expand NATO to the borders of Russia. And this was then the absolute lost chance, which was in this potential of 89. So I could say a lot more about this, but we have been in the middle of that. We tried to shape it. We really talked to many people in Poland, in Hungary, in Czechia, in Czechoslovakia first. And it would have been absolutely in the interest of all of these people and nations to go in this direction. And now we see the rubble field, which has been created by imposing the neoliberal system on the bankrupt communist system, which I had warned against, by the way, in many speeches I gave in 1990, where I said, if one now makes the mistake of superimposing on the bankrupt economic system of communism, the de facto equally bankrupt economic system of the neoliberal model, you may have a boom for a little bit, you may have a certain economic development, but you will have a collapse which will be much, much more severe than that of the communist system. And I think this is exactly where we are today.
I think it's pretty clear from this picture you just presented that the role of the official narrative is to maintain the stranglehold of British liberal, neoliberal free trade policy. And that's had an enormously negative effect overall in Europe as a whole. But there's a rebellion against it, and the opportunity to not continue this exists because of precisely what you just mentioned, the Belt and Road Initiative, And we have President Xi Jinping coming to Greece tomorrow. This is the alternative, isn't it?
Yeah, in one sense, the situation or the chance of 2019 is much bigger. Not so much because the Western establishment would have learned the lesson from this. As a matter of fact, you can see that the uh, so-called political elites of Europe and the Democrats and neocons in the United States, the opposition of Trump, they are completely unwilling to recognize what happened, and they have a completely wrong narrative. But it is a fact that the ideas which we presented at the beginning of the 90s, the Eurasian Landbridge, and as we later on published a study, the World Landbridge, the new Silk Road becomes the World Landbridge. That is a reality, and you have now a majority of countries in the world which are already going in this direction of a new world economic order, a new paradigm. And you mentioned Xi Jinping coming to Greece tomorrow, visiting Piraeus, and then he goes to Brazil to participate in the BRICS. And there are many, many countries, altogether 157 countries who are cooperating with this new system. So it would really be very easy for Europe and the United States to take the offer of Xi Jinping and just cooperate with China, with Russia, in the development of the Middle East, in the development of Africa, of Latin America, and we still could reconnect to that chance. But it has to occur soon. And at this point, we are facing a potential new crash. I think the situation in the United States is extremely polarized because the coup plotters who tried to topple Trump from even before he was elected president, they are still at it, and the situation is absolutely explosive. But I think, despite of that, to look back and look at what happened wrong and what could have been done in 89, 91 is absolutely crucial to come to a good solution for today.
And I will come to the US situation in just a moment, but I think it's worth noting that Secretary of State Pompeo gave a terrible address in Berlin yesterday, which was completely within the framework of the old paradigm. What did you think of what he said?
Oh, I think it was absolutely horrible. First of all, it was not what Trump is pushing as a policy, and he's the president, and Pompeo should just be the first diplomat, but not make policy. I mean, he went into a raving attack on Russia. He said that Putin is just a former KGB officer who served in Dresden. Now, for Pompeo, who was the director of the CIA, he doesn't seem to have a very high opinion of the intelligence services, but that speaks more about himself than it says anything about Putin. And then he attacked China, the Communist Party of China, the so-called authoritarian models, to which the Chinese foreign ministry reacted very sharply by saying Pompeo is simply on the wrong side of history. He is completely ignorant of Chinese policy, and he's just expressing a Cold War mentality. And I think this is really the problem, that the people who don't want to learn the lesson of what went wrong with the effort to impose an unipolar world, they are still thinking in Cold War terms. And I think this is really terrible. So, I think maybe Trump would be better served with a different person as a Secretary of State than this man.
Well, there's no better example of this Cold War mentality than the so-called Russiagate scandal, the continuation of that after that failed with Ukrainegate. This is quite tumultuous in the United States. And Helga, what are some of the leading developments in the last days around the impeachment that you want to call attention to?
Well, it is sort of tedious because it goes back and forth. I mean, obviously, people made a big thing about the fact that that one of the governors didn't win, despite that Trump went in to help his election campaign. But that was not Trump's fault because he got him up by many percentages. But people get nervous, they say, well, what does that mean for 2020? The Barr investigation is going very slow. So, I think the situation right now is a little bit undetermined. There are many good things happening, good things in the sense that more truth is coming out. Like, for example, a tweet appeared from a certain person who's the lawyer from the so-called whistleblower, the whistleblower whose name now is pretty much established to be this former CIA analyst, Ciamella. This is supposed not to be mentioned. Facebook and they basically eliminate all references to this person, but I think it's clear very much. So the lawyer of this guy, the so-called whistleblower, who's not a whistleblower, he's just an operative, I would say, a CIA operative. He put out a tweet in January 2017, that is immediately after Trump got in the White House, that the coup has started against Trump, that impeachment will follow, and that CNN will play a crucial role. So, I mean, the evidence that this was a coup, that the whole apparatus was involved, starting with the former intelligence heads of the Obama administration, this is all now coming out. And the Republican Congressman Nunes is now demanding that there should be new witnesses being asked in the investigation of Adam Schiff in the House Intelligence Committee, like Hunter Biden, Paul Volcker, the special envoy for Ukraine, and many others who would shed a different light in the whole affair. But the problem is you have a complete revolt of a certain apparatus. The Congress is mostly rotten. It's a terrible Congress. And so Trump has, basically only one option, and that is to go to the American people directly. And that is what he does. He attends rallies. He has absolute support from the Trump voters. But it is a very, very dangerous situation. And I think the key question is really, will he address the financial crisis? So far, there has been, references by Trump that the stock market is doing great, the US economy is doing great. But I think the big Achilles heel is that if there would be a crash, and there are many people who warn that, the crash is coming, it will come before 2020, the election, because the system is not sustainable. So what our colleagues in the United States are trying to do is to, really put the question of the 4 laws of my husband, Lyndon LaRouche, on the agenda, this package which he designed many years ago. You have to have a Glass-Steagall banking separation. You have to have a national bank for credit generation. There has to be a new Bretton Woods system for international credit arrangements with other countries. And you have to have a crash program to increase the productivity of the economy through a crash program of fusion of international space cooperation. And that has to be put on the agenda. So if you, our viewers, see any truth in what we have been discussing here, you should help us. You should help us to bring this agenda on the table, because this is not a moment to sit by. I think there is a tremendous chance because, you have Trump, you have Putin, Xi Jinping, and they all have an inclination to work together. But as you can see from the example of '89, sometimes in history, a chance to change something for the better exists only for a very brief moment. And when that moment is lost, then, history takes its course, and things can go in a terrible direction. And right now we are sitting on a powder keg. So please become active with us. Subscribe to our newsletter. Write to us. We will answer your questions. We will take them up in the next program. But get active with us, because this is a moment which only will, have a better outcome if enough citizens around the world get active with the Schiller Institute at this moment.
Helga, just one more quick thing on the US side of things. Michael Bloomberg, a super green billionaire, is now implying that he's going to enter the race. At the same time, we have this global bankers move for the Green New Deal. Any thoughts on that?
Well, Bloomberg is really, the worst thing which could happen to the United States, because he is absolutely in an alliance with such people as Mark Carney, who has called openly for a regime change, for replacing the power of sovereign governments with central banks. The central banks should make policy, is his recommendation. And Bloomberg is really already, for many years, if not decades, part of a current which is basically calling for a world government. I mean, he was involved in this initiative to have cities, smart mayors, and investment bankers running the world in a global system, in a world economic, in a really a world dictatorship of the central banks. And he wants to impose the green economy. He wants to go out of all coal plants in the United States by 2030. And this would really be a collapse of society, because if you go to decarbonization of the world economy, which is what the EU is pushing right now, Ursula von der Leyen, then the energy flux densities are just simply too low to maintain industrial economies. And given the fact that the nuclear potential of the world is still very, very far, maybe 10 years or more away from being able to replace carbon fuels, it would really mean a complete population reduction. And it probably would also trigger the collapse, because it would, if you go for the closing down of the coal plants, there is the danger of a complete collapse of all carbon-related assets in the world. So these people are really playing a very foolish and dangerous game. Bloomberg would be really the end of the United States as an industrial nation. So people should be smart, quick enough before it's too late.
Well, on a happier note, in addition to commemorating the 30th anniversary of the fall of the wall, today is Friedrich Schiller's birthday, and the Schiller Institute has been around for 35 years. And I think this is what does give us hope for a better future, doesn't it?
Well, the reason why the Schiller Institute is called Schiller Institute is because the ideas of Friedrich Schiller, and I say this despite the fact that we are now 35 years later after the founding of the Institute, are really the most beautiful image of man you can imagine. And for those of you who either have forgotten about Schiller because you read it in school and never looked at him ever since, or who have maybe not ever read him, read the plays of Schiller. If you can do it in German, that's the best, because he has such a beautiful language. But there are also some very good translations, which the Schiller Institute put out in English. But read the dramas, read the poems, read the aesthetical writings. And, the thing about Schiller is he has the idea that every human being has the potential to become a beautiful soul. And he defines this idea of a beautiful soul as somebody who passionately does his duty, for whom freedom and necessity is one thing. And then he develops this idea further and says the only people for whom this really is the case are the geniuses. But he says every person has the potential to become that. And many, many other beautiful ideas, which we should devote another program entirely to give it justice. So the Schiller Institute, when we founded it 35 years ago, had two major foci. One was a just new world economic order and a classical renaissance of classical art. So I think we are on a very good track in both directions. There are many countries in the world who are working towards a new world economic order together. And also, there are some countries who go very consciously back to the best traditions of their ancient histories. Greece is one of them. They have a very good relationship with China, among other things, because they regard themselves as ancient nations of the world, working together to revive these traditions. So I think, despite all the dangers, one can absolutely be optimistic, because there are now many forces in the world really understanding the need to move to a new era of mankind. And we have called this all the time a new Schillerzeit, a new era in the spirit of Friedrich Schiller, where the values would be shaped by the ideas of Schiller, and naturally not excluding people like Shakespeare, Dante, and other great poets. But I think the time comes for a completely different thinking about the potential of the human being. And I encourage you, read Friedrich Schiller, and you will be absolutely astounded what values and what treasures you find in his works.
And I'd say to our viewers, if you've been moved by what Helga's just been saying, both about Schiller and the Schiller Institute, and more broadly about the importance of having this opportunity succeed, join the Schiller Institute, become part of our movement, and make yourself the most beautiful soul you can be. So Helga, thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.
Yes, till next week.